Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast through that means, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to our forecast through that means as well. Or you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Taking a look now at the advisories and warning that we have out for our state, we'll start up north along the eastern portions of the Arctic coastline. We do have some snow and blowing snow conditions all along the area there in the northeast, where we do have a winter weather advisory for snow and blowing snow that could drop visibilities down to a half mile or less. And then we have a blizzard warning out by AKwx, and that could drop visibilities down to a quarter mile or less. And then we do have those out from midnight tonight until midnight on Wednesday night. Again, blowing snow conditions are going to be in effect along the coastline of the northeast starting tonight around midnight, and that will go through tomorrow night around midnight. Then down in the Fairbanks area, specifically on the Chena River, we do have a flood advisory in effect for ice jam flooding that is right near Hunts Creek. Be advised if you're in the area to watch out for flooding, as we do have some flooding again along the Chena River, ice jam flooding. That is going to be out until tomorrow afternoon, so Wednesday afternoon. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we'll start way out west. We do have one system moving in by the western Aleutians, bringing some cloud cover and precipitation to the area. Starting this loop again, we'll look south of the eastern Aleutians. We have a system coming up from the south, bringing some cloud cover to the area along the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. Then by the southern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, we can see a weaker low moving into the area, bringing cloud cover and precipitation to areas along the southeastern portions of the state. And then one more time, we can watch some of the lingering cloud cover and showers that we do have out over the southern portions of mainland Alaska, bringing some precipitation to the area of around south central. As we look at our precipitation for the remainder of the day, we'll start way out west again. Our low pressure by the western Aleutians, warm enough to bring rain to the islands, and we will have some rain showers throughout the remainder of the Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula. Low pressure out over the southern portions of the Gulf, bringing rain to areas along the North Gulf Coast and into the Panhandle area. However, as we get to higher elevations in both of these locations, we do expect that to be primarily snow. And as we push further into mainland Alaska from south central up into southern portions of the interior, we'll again see a mix of rain and snow. We do expect the low-lying areas to see primarily rain, and then higher elevations to see primarily snow. And as we get closer towards the upper Yukon Valley, we do expect all precipitation to fall primarily as snow. And then we do have along the Arctic coastline ridging that is keeping that precipitation at bay further to the south. As we look into tonight's weather, we'll stay up north. We do have a trough moving through that's going to start to kick up those blowing snow and snow conditions along that Arctic coastline. And then we will have some areas of fog throughout the interior down to much of the west coast of the state. We'll start to see more snow down in south central, and as we get closer towards the coast, we will expect that to be primarily rain. Down in the Panhandle area, low pressure out over the eastern Gulf, also bringing rain to much of the Panhandle with some areas of mixed precipitation going further to the north. Further west, we do have rain out for the Alaska Peninsula and down in the eastern Aleutians, but a mix of rain and snow for the remainder of the Aleutian Islands overnight. As we move into Wednesday, going to see primarily rain for the Aleutian Islands. Some areas by the western Aleutians cold enough to see the rain-snow mix. We'll have some rain around the Bristol Bay area, and then as we get into areas around the mountains, especially in the Alaska Range, primarily going to see snow there. But as we drop down into the valleys and near the water, we do expect primarily rain for south central Alaska. As we move up into the southern or southeastern portions of the interior, a mix of rain and snow is expected. And then up along the Arctic coastline, going to continue to see the snow falling with some of those areas of blowing snow along the northeastern portions of the coast. Then dropping down into the Panhandle area with that onshore flow off the Gulf, we are expecting primarily rain for southeast Alaska. As we move into Thursday, we are going to continue to see rain with those winds coming off of the Gulf of Alaska, primarily rain for most locations, until we get to some of the more interior locations by the Haines and Skagway area, where higher elevations are expecting to see some snow. South central Alaska, primarily rain, but higher elevations again going to see some snow, and that's going to be true in the interior as well, especially those eastern locations. Low-lying areas, primarily rain, higher elevations, primarily snow. And then up in the southern portions of the North Slope into northern portions of the Brooks Range, expecting to see some snow up there. And then down in southeast Alaska or southwest Alaska, some snow or rain around Bristol Bay area, down into the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutian Islands. Then a mix of rain and snow for the western Aleutians. For our temperatures out through the Aleutian Islands, Mid to upper 30s are expected. That's going to extend into southwest Alaska and south central Alaska. So move north throughout the state. Temperatures are going to drop down into the 20s and then down into the teens throughout much of the northern part of the state and along the Arctic coastline and down into the single digits, and down into the 40s for the Panhandle. Wednesday afternoon getting to the mid 40s for the Panhandle, south central, and much of southwest Alaska, into the 30s for much of the interior, and then up into the teens for much of the Arctic coastline. So you drop down to Thursday morning, staying up north. We'll have single digits in the northeastern portions of the state, into the teens as we drop down into the interior, southern portions of the interior, to the 20s to low 30s, mid 30s for southwest and south central Alaska to include much of the Aleutians, and down around 40 degrees for much of the Panhandle. Thursday afternoon, temperatures are going to pick back up to the mid to upper 40s for the Panhandle and South Central. That will extend out over southwest Alaska as well, and right around 40 degrees for the Aleutians. Up in the interior, mid 30s to right around 40 degrees are expected, with 20s for the Seward Peninsula. And then along the Arctic coastline, warmer out west, getting up into the lower 20s, and then into the teens for the eastern portions of the Arctic coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather for Wednesday morning. Out over the Bering Sea, northern locations seeing a lot of MVFR, but as we get towards the Pribilof Islands and all throughout the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, we are expecting IFR conditions. IFR conditions are going to extend in over much of southwest Alaska and out over south central Alaska as well. As you move further north in mainland Alaska, we are expecting it to turn to MVFR conditions for much of the interior, then VFR conditions as we approach the Brooks Range, but back to MVFR conditions along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, we are expecting MVFR or IFR conditions to persist. That's going to extend out over the Gulf of Alaska as well. As we move into Wednesday afternoon, IFR conditions are expected to remain for much of the Gulf of Alaska and for the Panhandle area. Much of South Central have cleared up to MVFR conditions that will extend out over southwest Alaska as well, and then VFR conditions up for much of the interior and along the Seward Peninsula area. Up along the Arctic coastline, back to MVFR conditions with some areas of IFR as well. Down in the Bering Sea, out west, primarily MVFR conditions, and as we get more to the east, expecting more IFR conditions to pick up. As we move into Thursday morning, out over the Bering, again, more MVFR conditions to the central and western locations, IFR conditions as we get further to the east. However, as we approach southwest Alaska, still primarily MVFR over the southwestern portion of the state. South central Alaska, however, will be down to IFR conditions Thursday morning, but conditions will improve as we move further to the north. Interior part of the state will be a mixture of VFR and MVFR conditions, and then MVFR conditions along the Arctic coastline. Down in the Panhandle area, IFR conditions are expected, with primarily IFR conditions out over the Gulf as well. Thursday afternoon, things finally clearing up in the Panhandle area where we will start to see some MVFR conditions, and then an area of IFR conditions extending along the North Gulf Coast, and MVFR conditions for much of the remainder of south central Alaska. Up in the interior, primarily VFR conditions are expected with some isolated areas of MVFR, and then primarily MVFR along the Arctic coastline. Down for southwest Alaska, primarily MVFR by the water with some areas of VFR as we get further inland. And then eastern portions of the Bering Sea are still going to see IFR conditions. However, an area of VFR conditions out over central portions of the Aleutians, but back to IFR as we move out over the western Aleutian Islands. For our passes, starting up north, Anaktuvuk Pass will start off VFR, drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Hadigan Pass will also start off VFR, drop to marginal conditions later in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start IFR and improve to marginal conditions. Rainy Pass also starting off IFR, improving to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Windy Pass also starting IFR, improve to marginal conditions. Isabel Pass will start off IFR, improve to marginal as well. And Sobel-Mentasta starting off IFR, improving to marginal conditions Wednesday afternoon. Fortunita Pass should stay IFR throughout the day on Wednesday, as well as Portage. And we do expect Chilkoot and White to both remain IFR throughout the day on Wednesday. Taking a look at our freezing levels, surface freezing line riding north of the Panhandle area through much of south central Alaska and southwest Alaska, and down through central portions of the Bering Sea. We do have some of the areas of warmer air coming in from the eastern portions of the Gulf towards the Panhandle area, and then another tongue of warmer air by the eastern Aleutian Islands with freezing levels as high as 4,000 feet near the Aleutians. For our icing on Wednesday, out over the central and eastern Aleutians, between 3,000 and 6,000 feet is expected. Over south central Alaska, above 4,000 feet is expected. Above 7,000 feet for the Panhandle area, and then below 7,000 feet as we get up to the Arctic coastline. For our jet stream, we do have the strongest portion of the jet interacting with our area at 105 knots out of a northwesterly direction near the western Aleutians. Northeasterly component of the jet moving out over the central and eastern Aleutians at around 80 knots. Northwesterly flow out over the northern portions of the Bering, 70 knots there. And then exiting out over the eastern portions of the mainland, westerly winds 75 knots are expected. Down to 9,000 feet. Weaker flow over much of mainland Alaska, up along the Arctic coast a little bit stronger northerly flow, 30 knots there. Westerly flow out over the Panhandle around 30 knots. And then as we move out over the Bering Sea, easterly flow for most locations around 30 knots for the western, central, and eastern Aleutian Islands, with an area of 50 knots out of the west, just south of the western Aleutians. So drop down to 3,000 feet. Pretty similar flow, easterly winds out over the Bering Sea, 30 to 35 knots, interacting with the islands as well, 35 knots near the eastern Aleutians. Pretty calm over much of mainland Alaska, with some flow just offshore the Arctic coastline out of the west around 40 knots, and then southwesterly flow out over the Panhandle area, around 25 knots expected for the central and northern locations, weaker as we get further to the south. For our turbulence, just one area of turbulence out over the central portion of the Panhandle. We are expecting that to be below 5,000 feet.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster. Is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, you know, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jay Zwally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today.
How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean and therefore is made from seawater. The biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica, down near the South Pole, collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All 3 of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist, elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For our marine section, we'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We do still have the ice edge south of Nunavik Island and some areas in the Bristol Bay area. However, we do have some breaks in the ice from the ice edge up to the shorefast ice along the southwest coastline. We are seeing that become less dense as we are still getting some melting. However, the ice edge itself is pushing off a little bit to the south just because of the wind direction. So even though the ice edge does seem to be advancing slowly to the south, there is a lot less dense anywhere from the ice edge up to that shorefast ice along southwest Alaska. Taking a look now in southeast, starting in the inside waters, out of the southerly direction, 10 to 20 knots is expected, seas as high as 4 feet. Out over the Gulf, primarily a westerly flow, 10 to 15 knots up north, becoming a little bit stronger up to as high as 20 knots and becoming more southerly as we get into southern portions of the Gulf. Then on Thursday, out in the Gulf, southerly winds 10 knots, and in the inside waters, starting off weaker in the south, out of the southeast at 10 knots, getting up to as high as 25 knots out of the south towards Lynn Canal. Then we have out over south central Alaska, southerly winds throughout the area on Wednesday, all around 10 knots with seas as high as 7 feet in the northern portions of the Gulf. Then on Thursday, still pretty weak, 10 knots in most all locations out of a southeasterly direction, a little bit stronger east of the Barrens up to as high as 15 knots there. Down in the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, primarily an easterly direction, 10 to 15 knots getting strongest as we move further to the west, seas as high as 6 feet on the Pacific side. Then on Thursday, still easterly by Kodiak Island, but a little bit stronger, around 20 knots now by the island. Then 15 knots as we move into the Bering, and becoming more northerly as we get further off to the west, then up to as high as 20 knots out of that northerly direction south of the peninsula. On Wednesday for the Aleutians, all out of the northeast, 20 to 25 knots with seas as high as 9 feet, highest on the Bering side. Then on Thursday for the central and eastern Aleutians, out of the north, 15 to 20 knots is expected. Then for the western Aleutians, out of the east, 15 to 25 knots, strongest as we get further off to the west. Along the west coast of the state, northerly flow on Wednesday, 15 to 20 knots, seas as high as 6 feet by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Thursday, continuing the north winds, 15 to 20 knots, strongest by the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline for Wednesday, westerly winds 20 to 30 knots, getting strongest by the Beaufort Sea, and then down the west coast, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots. Then on Thursday, variable winds 10 knots along the Arctic coastline, and then down the west coast, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots are expected. For weather for the remainder of tonight, we do have a low pressure system out by the western Aleutians, bringing a mix of rain and snow to the central and western Aleutians. Another trough pushing into the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain to the area with some rain showers extending up by Kodiak Island and into the Bristol Bay area. Mix of rain and snow for south central, with low-lying areas expecting to see rain, or as we get into the mountains, expecting that to be mixed with snow. As we push up into those southeastern portions of the interior, we are expecting that to be primarily snow, with areas of fog developing through much of the interior down into the YK Delta area and up along the west coast. Then along the Arctic coastline, we are expecting some snow to move back into the area with a trough pushing through. And as that snow and wind start to make it to that northeastern portions of the Arctic coastline, we are expecting some snow and blowing snow conditions to develop. We have a winter weather advisory out in the Dead Horse area and a blizzard warning out for the Kaktovik area. Those are both going to be in effect midnight tonight into midnight on Wednesday. And those could drop visibilities down to a half mile in the advisory and a quarter mile for the blizzard. Down in the Panhandle area, we are expecting some rain from the low pressure system out over the eastern portions of the Gulf, bringing that southwesterly wind to the area, bringing that fetch of moisture off the water, continuing to see rain for the Panhandle, with a mix of rain and snow as we get further to the north, especially at the higher elevations. As we move into Wednesday, that flow off the water for the Panhandle is going to continue bringing rain to much of the area. Again, with some of the areas up by Haines and Skagway, a little bit colder at the higher elevations, expect to see a rain and snow mix. Then rain all along the North Gulf Coast into much of South Central, where we still have in the higher elevations a mix of rain and snow. Again, along the Arctic coastline, we are expecting to continue to see snow throughout the day on Wednesday, with blowing snow conditions in that northeastern locations. Dropping down into the southwestern portions of the state, we are going to have some rain for the Bristol Bay area, and then rain throughout the Alaska Peninsula, much of the Aleutian Islands, with the western Aleutians staying a little bit colder, expecting to see a rain and snow mix there. But some of this precipitation is going to stay away from the Pueblos for now. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.